So today, Tim will be talking about his book, The Meaning of Marriage. So please join me in welcoming Tim Keller.
Yes, I wrote this book, Meaning of Marriage, with my wife, Kathy, and so I'm going to try to convey not only, and I'm serious about this, not only the sort of things that I want to say today, but what she would want me to say too. I'm here to convey the basic points of the book. It's called The Meaning of Marriage. I'm actually here then to tell you something about the Christian view of marriage. The book's an exposition of the classic Christian biblical idea of marriage. Now you might, by way of introduction, you might say, well, that's kind of partisan. Let me take a minute to argue that all views of marriage are partisan. Whatever your view of marriage is, it's based to some degree on religious or semi-religious convictions about human life, meaning in life, things like that. John Witte, W-I-T-T-E, John Witte Jr., who's a major legal scholar at Emory University, and he's an expert in marriage, the history of marriage law. He talks about how marriage evolves in a society. But what he points out in his books, if you can look at any of his articles or books, they're fascinating. He says, whatever your view of marriage is, it's based on certain ideas that are almost religious. So, for example, he says, if you think divorce laws should be easier, in other words, the divorce should be easier, or if you think, no, divorce laws should be such that divorce is very, very hard, why would you make that decision?
So in panic, as this is what?
Fire alarms going off on this stream.
All right, I promise not to say anything bad about the disembodied voice ever again.
Hey, if you're on VC, can you mute yourself?
There, see, that was the promise they were waiting.
Thanks. Sorry.
I can't believe they listened to you. So, for example, he says, if you are from an Eastern background, you believe the meaning of life is to sublimate the individual to the group, to the family. The meaning of life is to find your role in the whole and be part of the community. If you're from the West, you've been affected by the Enlightenment, and you believe the meaning of life is individual fulfillment, and the individual's interests and desires and rights have to come before the rights of the group. He says, now, are any of those views scientific? No. They have to do with your view of human nature and what is right and wrong and meaning in life, and they're religious or quasi-religious. And therefore, your view of marriage is always, to some degree, partisan. It's always, to some degree, based on ideas that aren't scientific, they're not neutral, they're not objective. So I'm bringing up something I think is important, which is the Christian view of marriage. Why? Well, we live in a culture where a generation ago, 75% of all adults in America were married. Today, it's down to 50%. There's clearly a lot of questions about how viable and tenable marriage is. I think what Christianity says about marriage can be extremely helpful to many, many, many people in our culture. So here's 3 points, maybe 4, because I watched my watch. 3 points that I think get across a lot of the ideas of the book, which is some of the basic ideas of the Christian view of marriage. First of all, the essence of marriage. What is the essence of marriage? I can't tell you how often I've actually heard people say this. I've heard people say it in one way or another in movies, television shows, or in person. They say, I love you. Why do I need a piece of paper to tell you I love you? The piece of paper, the marriage thing, it's legal. It's not the essence of marriage. The essence of marriage, in that view, is passion and feeling. That's the essence of marriage, not contracts and legal things. On the contrary, the Christian view of marriage is that the essence of marriage is a long-term binding commitment epitomized in a covenant or a legal contract. A long-term binding commitment is the essence of marriage, not the passion and feeling, because that comes and goes, and comes, and then goes, and then comes. The thing that actually is the essence of marriage is that long-term binding commitment through a covenant. And here's the reasons why that's so important. And I know this is counterintuitive to contemporary people. First of all, the legal covenant actually makes marriage more intimate, not less. You know, there's 2 basic kinds of relationships. I'm going to call them consumer and covenant. A consumer relationship is like the relationship you have with your local grocer. You have a relationship with the grocer as long as the grocer is giving you produce at good produce at a good cost. But if you find somebody who gives you much better produce at a much better cost, you're going to go to the other grocer. Why? Because your individual needs are more important than the relationship. In a consumer-vendor relationship, your needs are more important than the relationship. In a covenant relationship, let's give you another example, parent-child. You're raising a child, the child cries, the child's selfish, the child's ill-behaved, and you can't say, I've had it, like you can with a grocer, and just leave the child on somebody else's doorstep. You'll go to jail. And the reason is, at least our understanding is, your relationship with your child is not a consumer-vendor relationship, it's a covenant relationship. Now, when you're dating somebody or seeing somebody or having a relationship with somebody, a romantic relationship, but you're not married, the other person could walk away any time. And therefore, you're essentially in a consumer relationship in spite of all the rhetoric. In other words, you're still basically in marketing and promoting yourself. You have to. You've got to literally put your best face on because that other person could walk. But when you get married and when you say, I'm bound to you through thick and thin, and when you have that legal contract, it creates a cradle of security for your vulnerability. It makes it possible to say, here's who I am and here's what's wrong. It makes it possible for you to actually be more intimate, more yourself. Just a piece of paper. First of all, the piece of paper, which is the contract, creates intimacy. Secondly, the piece of paper creates stability. In the book, I give you some research that shows that when you ask people, are their marriages happy or unhappy, 2/3 of all marriages that say they're unhappy, if they don't break up, 5 years later say they're happy. 2/3. What is it that keeps you in there for the incredible reward of getting through hard times into something really great, a good marriage? The answer is it's that piece of paper. Remember Ulysses in the famous myth tied himself to the mast as he was going by the island of the Sirens. Why? Because he knew he was going to kind of go crazy for a while. But he also knew that he'd get over it, and he didn't want to wreck the ship while he was when he wasn't thinking straight. So he tied himself to his mast. That's what a marriage covenant is. It ties you to the mast to get you through those times. In most cases, if you're able to stick with it, you get into something richer. It creates that stability. This is why W.H. Auden, no small intellect, says this about marriage. It's a fascinating quote. He says, like everything which is not the involuntary result of fleeting emotion, but rather the creation of time and will, any marriage, happy or unhappy, is infinitely more interesting than any romance, however passionate. That's an amazing statement. Any marriage, happy or unhappy, is infinitely more interesting than any romance, however passionate. Why? Because everything which is not the involuntary result of fleeting emotion, but the creation of time and will, is more interesting. So, that little piece of paper, the essence of marriage, the long-term binding commitment, it creates intimacy, it creates stability, it also creates freedom. Kierkegaard talked a lot about why a marriage covenant was important. He said, if you don't know the discipline of making a promise and saying, in marriage, your marriage vows are not, I love you, I feel wonderful toward you, I want to serve you, I want to please you. That's not what a marriage vow is. Listen to them. The marriage vow is, I promise to be faithful, be loving, be serving. I promise to be doing these things regardless of my feelings in the future. You're making a promise. And Kierkegaard actually says, if you don't know the discipline of making a promise and sticking with it, you are actually not a free person. You are actually enslaved to your impulses. You're slave to the moment. You're enslaved to the circumstances. You're enslaved to your feelings. Hannah Arendt, again, no minor intellect, says something about that when she says, without being bound to the fulfillment of our promises, we would never be able to keep our identities. We would be condemned to wander helplessly and without direction in the darkness of each person's lonely heart, caught in the contradictions and equivocalities of it. Lewis Smedes, much less well known, but a sort of a Dutch-American philosopher, writes this about marriage promises. He says, "When I make a promise, I bear witness that my future with you is not locked into a bionic beam by which I was stuck, with which I was stuck through the fateful combinations of X's and Y's in the hand I was dealt with out of my parents' genetic deck." Next sentence is better. "When I make a promise, I testify that I was not routed along some unalterable itinerary by the psychic conditioning visited on me by my slightly wacky parents. When I make a promise, I declare that my future with people who depend on me is not predetermined by the mixed-up culture of my tender years. I am not fated, I am not determined, I am not a lump of human dough whipped into shape by the contingent reinforcement and aversive conditioning of my past. I know as well as the next person I cannot create my life de novo. I am well aware that much of what I am and what I do is a gift or a curse from my past, but when I make a promise to anyone, I rise above all the conditioning that limits me. No German shepherd ever promised to be there with me. No home computer ever promised to be a loyal help. Only a person can make a promise, and when you do, you are most free." See, the essence of marriage is not the passion and the feeling which comes and goes and comes and goes. It's that long-term binding commitment. And sometimes I've actually said to people who say, "Well, he says he wants to live with me, but he doesn't want to marry me. He says he loves me, but he doesn't want to marry me." I say, well, he's probably saying, "I don't love you enough to marry you. I don't love you enough to actually lose my independence. I don't love you enough to bind myself to you. I don't love you enough to marry you." So obviously the essence of marriage in the Christian understanding of things is that long-term binding commitment epitomized in a covenant, and it's really important, that piece of paper. It's what takes a consumer relationship and makes it something of intimacy, of stability, of freedom, of beauty. Secondly, I'd like to talk to you about the mission of marriage, not the essence. What's your marriage for? What are you hoping to accomplish through your marriage? I'm afraid an awful lot of people, for an awful lot of people today, marriage is for romance and fun, and maybe kind of merging your net worth to build a somewhat more comfortable life financially and materially. But what is your real goal? The Christian understanding of the mission or goal of marriage is deep character change through deep friendship. Deep character change through deep friendship. Empirical studies show, anecdotal evidence is, and even, I just saw the other day, an eHarmony TV ad confirms that what people are looking for today is what they call a perfectly compatible soulmate. Now, if you ask most people what that means, they usually say, and that's what I mean by when I said I just saw the other day an eHarmony TV ad. It was a guy up there saying, "I'm looking for my perfect soulmate, somebody who will accept me just as I am, and I can appreciate her just as she is." And really, the surveys show that when people talk about a perfectly, especially men, by the way, say, "I'm looking for somebody who will not change me, and somebody who will accept me just as I am." Now, there's an enormous problem with this. If that's your idea of compatibility, somebody who is low maintenance, doesn't need a lot of change, somebody who's not going to demand a lot of change from you, somebody with whom you already have all this great chemistry, you're going to have a lot of fun with, this is the reason why you're not getting married. Because there really isn't anybody like that out there. You're trying to pose as somebody like that so they'll marry you, but you're not like that either. Now listen. Look, when you get married, you're coming into with all your flaws. Let me just give you a list that I thought about the other day when I was getting ready to come here. You may be a fearful person with a tendency to great anxiety, a proud person with a tendency to be selfish, an inflexible person with a tendency to be demanding, an undisciplined person with a tendency to be unreliable, a perfectionistic person who tends to be too critical of other people, an impatient, irritable person who tends to hold grudges, a cowardly person who tends to twist the truth to look good. And that's just the first 10. I'm not going to go on. Everybody comes into marriage with stuff like that. And you know, your siblings told you about it, your parents told you about it, but you kind of wrote it off. You know, you kind of agree to it because you have to agree to it, but you really don't think it's as serious as people say. And so it's never really sunk in. Your flaws have not sunk in. And then you get married. And now the same flaws that created small problems for you in other relationships create big problems in this relationship, and you can't avoid it because there are no two compatible people. All people come in flawed, and therefore you're fundamentally incompatible. All people come in selfish and self-centered, so everybody's fundamentally incompatible. In fact, marriage will bring out the worst in you. I remember there was a bridge when I was a little kid. There was an old stone bridge where I lived, and there were actually stress fractures, and it was really a bridge in trouble. You couldn't see it until some big truck would come over it, and then the weight would not create the fissures and fractures, but would reveal them. They would get bigger, and you could actually see them. It was very scary and dangerous, and I have no idea why I was standing under the bridge looking at the time. That's probably because I was 10 years old. But the point is, your spouse is a huge Mack truck coming through your life, coming onto your heart, and not creating the problems, but showing the problems that were there. There's huge incompatibilities. And it's not just that you're incompatible because when you come into marriage, but actually you change when you get into marriage. Stanley Hauerwas of Duke University has this very famous and to many people infuriating passage. He says, the assumption is that there is someone just right for us to marry, and that if we look closely enough, we will find that just right person. This assumption overlooks a very crucial aspect to marriage. It fails to appreciate the fact that you always marry the wrong person. We never know whom we marry, we just think we do. Or even if we first marry the right person, just give it a while and he or she will change. For marriage, being the enormous thing it is, means we are not the same person after we've entered it. One of the primary challenges of marriage is learning how to love and care for the stranger to whom you so often find yourself married. Now, if this is true, that you always marry the wrong person, you always marry an incompatible person, and even if the person isn't incompatible, when you marry him or her, the person will get incompatible. If this is true, and I dare you to find somebody who's been married more than a few years who will deny that, then three things, and these are the Christian responses to this. First of all, the Christian idea of marriage is based on the biblical idea of human sin. You know, the Bible, the Christian teaching is that all human beings are selfish and sinful. We all want to be our own little gods. That's the biblical view. And therefore, if you are informed by the Christian view of marriage, when you get into marriage, you're not going to be shocked. One of the biggest reasons why you have, the Kim Kardashian thing happen is because people are shocked they haven't been actually prepared. And they think because they've been told that if you have the perfect soulmate, these clashes shouldn't happen. The fact of the matter is you're brought into marriage and you knock the rough edges off of each other, just like two gems put into a gem tumbler knock the rough edges off of each other. Because they're moved around and they polish each other. But there's a clash, there's a constructive clash. So the first thing is you embrace that. In fact, you talk about it before you get married. You say, this is one of our missions in life, and that is to help each other grow into people that we would never grow into if we weren't married to each other. That's one of your purposes. Secondly, if this is true, then you shouldn't be looking for a finished, this is what Kathy would say if she was here. When you're trying to think about a prospective spouse, don't look for a finished statue, look for a great block of marble. That's what she would say. And here's what she means by that. You want to fall in love with the person you got in front of you. But just as important, you want to be in love with the person you see that person becoming. Whenever one of our favorite places in the world for Kathy and me to go is the western part of England, either northern Wales or the Highlands of Scotland or the Lake District. And one of the problems, if any of you know anything about those areas, is it's always raining there. There's these gorgeous mountains, and you can go there for like 3 or 4 days, and you don't see the mountains, or you only see it briefly. In fact, what usually happens is you're sitting there and you're looking out your window day after day, and you see nothing but beautiful green grass. That's why it's always so green. And then suddenly it starts to clear. And then the sun kind of comes out, and it parts, and there's this gorgeous mountain, and you look at it for an hour, and then it starts to rain again. That's it. You remember where it was. There it was. In many ways, when you fall in love with somebody, you're supposed to be You don't overdo what the person looks like, first of all, because they're not going to stay looking like that. If you want to have the absolute richness of a long-term marriage, don't overdo what they look like, because you're going to change anyway. But don't even look only at their character now. I mean, what you're looking for is you're looking at things like character, courage, wisdom, strength, self-denial, empathy, the ability to understand other people. You're looking for all those things, but what you should every so often get a glimpse, but then it usually goes away, of some great thing this person is becoming. The Christian idea is you fall in love especially with not just the person as he or she is, but the person that he or she is becoming. And the Christian idea is you say, your future excites me, and I want to be there with God making you into that great future person. I mean, the whole idea, sorry, this is a bit of a bridge too far, I imagine, for some who are listening to me, but I mean, the Christian idea is that someday, instead of standing in front of, the priest or the pastor or the rabbi or all that, when you'll go up there to get married, someday you're standing before the throne in heaven, and you're now fully everything that God wants you to be, and you look at each other and you say, I always knew you could be like this. I always saw glimpses of it, and now look at you. And to know I was part of that process. I know, listen, this is part of the mission of marriage. It's falling in love not just with the person as they are, but the person as they're going to be. And what that means then, if you're going to be in a relationship, here's the last thing about this mission idea. The mission of marriage, if it's really true that no two people are compatible, you're always incompatible, you need to embrace that incompatibility, you expect the conflict. Secondly, you fall in love not just with a person who's perfect now, but a person that you see the person becoming, great raw material, etc. You expect there to be changes. But lastly, you should be looking for somebody who is or could be your best friend. See, if that's the purpose of marriage, deep character change through deep friendship, then you're looking for somebody who could be your most trusted counselor and your best friend, even if the person isn't yet. See, here's what really happens is you're a single person, you walk in a room of other singles, let's say there's 10 other people there. You immediately, by looking at them, eliminate 7. You know you do. It's all on the basis of looks and polish. And then you go to the 3 that you think, there could be some chemistry here. And then, probably your best candidate for somebody who could be a lifelong friend partner, you just eliminated it, didn't make your first cut. You should be looking for somebody who can be your best partner, and I guess your best friend. And maybe I should just end this point saying this. Somebody's going to say, so you're just saying sexual chemistry and attraction means nothing? Oh, no, I'm not saying that at all. But I want you to think of it this. Friendship does not flow out of great sexual chemistry. Sexual chemistry grows out of terrific friendship. You know why? There's nothing more sexy than knowing that somebody you admire to the skies admires you. The praise of the praiseworthy is above all rewards. It's when somebody that you admire to the sky thinks you're incredible. There's nothing more powerfully sexy than that. So, do the friendship and the sexual chemistry, a lasting sexual chemistry, will be there. So the sexual chemistry flows out of the friendship, not the friendship out of the sexual chemistry. Listen, when I first kissed my wife, and I don't mean as my wife, I mean the very first time went out with Kathy, we spent some time together, this is before we were married, and I kissed her. What electricity? Now, somebody's going to say, do you get that same electricity now when you kiss her 35, 37 years later that you did then? I said, no, of course not. I said, isn't that a shame? I said, no. When I look back, I know the incredible thrill I got the first time I held her hand and she squeezed it back, the first time I kissed her and she kissed me back. It was ego. I wasn't loving her. I had no idea who she was, really. I was in love with the idea this girl likes me. In other words, she likes me. It seems like sexual it seems like sexual love. It's really ego. It's a rush. It's a rush to your head. I would never, ever want to go back to the shallowness of the feeling I had the first time I kissed her. I would never give that up. The difference between kissing her then and kissing her now is the difference between a deep river that makes no noise, that's now, and a babbling brook that made a lot of noise, but it was like 1 inch deep. Lastly, the secret of marriage. The secret of marriage, and then the secret of the secret, okay? The secret of marriage is to be able to love your spouse during seasons in which you're getting very little, if any, love back. I've already referred to that a little bit with the Ulysses Mass thing, but the fact is that there are going to be times in your married life. This will be true for you too, as well. But I'm doing this from your point of view. There will be times in which your spouse is sick. There'll be times in which your spouse is discouraged. There'll be times in which your spouse is sort of absorbed in his or her problems. And during those times, it is absolutely critical when you're actually not, the person's not really serving you much, the person's not really noticing you, not being attentive to you, the person's just attentive to themselves because they're absorbed in their issues and problems. It's extremely important during those times to be able to keep on giving love even when you're not getting much love back. However, that takes a source of love from outside. But before I get there, when I say that's the secret, think about this. How many times have I seen this over the years? Because I'm old enough to have seen it. You get married, you have children. Now, as the child is growing up, the child gives you very little love in the very beginning. Really, I mean, it's years before the child says, "I'm proud of you." That's a red letter date. I don't know when that happens. But in other words, you give and you give to your kid, and your whole life kind of goes away, your freedom goes away, and the kid gives you very, very little. But you just give, and sometimes the kid gives you hugs back, sometimes the kid gives you, feedback, good feedback. But by and large, you give and you don't get. Now you're married. What happens the first time your spouse? And I'll do this from my point of view. First time my spouse isn't really loving me like I want. You know what I do? I say, well, you're not being the wife you used to be. I don't have to be the husband I used to be. That sounds like justice, but it's actually revenge. It's revenge, okay? However, that's what you do. And every time your spouse pulls back, you pull back. And your spouse pulls back, and you pull back. As 18 years go by, you give no matter what your kid does for you. And by the end of 18 years, even if the kid's an absolute mess, you love that child. But over the years, what happens, the less you act loving, the less you feel loving. And the less you feel loving, the less you act loving. And after 18 years, there's like no love left at all. Generally speaking, you'll find with your child that so many times you don't feel any love to your child. You just have to give to the child. You have to come home. You have to sacrifice. You have to do all these things for the child. You don't feel any kind of passion or love for the child. But your actions of love lead to deep feelings of love in the long run. But your behavior with your spouse has always been, when your spouse isn't loving you, you don't love the spouse back. At the end of 18 years, you love your child, you don't love your spouse. The child goes off to college, and the marriage falls apart. And it's your fault. Because the same basic idea that you practice with your child, you didn't practice with your spouse. And that is, during those times in which your spouse isn't loving you that much, you love that spouse anyway. I call that love philanthropy. And here's why I call it love philanthropy. It's love philanthropy because you can only be philanthropic financially if you have a pretty good source of income from somewhere. Isn't that right? I mean, the only reason why you can give these great big gifts to charity and great big gifts here and there is because you're making a lot of money somewhere else. Your gifts are gifts. When you give to a charity, you don't expect a return on your investment. It's gone. It's philanthropy. But you can afford it because the money's coming here. If, on the other hand, you're getting no money from outside and you just have to make money like this, well, then you have to be much more careful. You can't be philanthropic. You've got to make investments and get a return on your investment. Getting a lot of money from here, you can give out a lot of money over here. You can give a lot of love to your spouse, even in those hard times, if you're really getting an enormous amount of love from somewhere else. Now, the only possible way to get a source of love that strong without being unfaithful to your spouse is to have a relationship with God. That's the Christian idea. If God's love is a reality to you, then you actually can get through those periods of time. You're like a philanthropist. If God's love is a reality to you, you don't melt down when your spouse isn't loving you. You don't melt down and go freak out. as you will if your spouse is the main source of love income. If your spouse is the main source of love income, you will freak out when your spouse goes through those dry periods and is not giving you anything. But if God is the main source of your love income, then you can handle it, and you can stick to it, and you can get through it, and you can keep tied to the mast, as it were, until you come to your senses. It all comes from this verse in Ephesians chapter 5, where Paul talks to husbands and wives and says, love one another as Christ loved the church and gave himself. When Jesus was on the cross, he looks down at all the people who are betraying him, and they're denying him, and they're forsaking him. And in one of the great acts of love in the history of the world, he just stayed. He didn't leave. And he didn't love us because we were lovely. He loved us to make us lovely. And that is the pattern and the paragon and the paradigm for the Christian idea of marriage. So I'm going to stop there. There's always more to say, but I understand I can take questions for about 25 minutes if I stop now. Yeah. So, and my guess is that there's plenty of things you might want to ask me about where I wasn't clear or where I just didn't, or subjects I just didn't touch on. Now, you're going to have to speak into the mic because there's people after this who will watch this recorded or who are watching from somewhere else. Go ahead.
Mr. Keller, thank you for coming and for your talk. I wanted to ask you about when you were talking about finding a spouse. And I'm kind of thinking you had said don't look at it only from the purely physical, try to see about the evolution of the person, your evolution.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering about criteria for finding that slab to make into a piece of art and it's going to help you become an artwork. Would you have some, maybe like top 5 things to look
more
for?
Things,
how
sure.
do you find courage? How do you look at like in the past, in the present, and future?
I'll give you at least 2. I think you just said 4 or 5. I'll give you 2, and if I think of a couple for selection criteria. First of all, you want somebody who really understands you. Somebody who you feel like, boy, this person really understands me almost a little better than I understand myself. That's what I meant when I said you're going to have to find somebody who can almost be your best friend and trusted counselor. Somebody who seems to anticipate pretty well how you're going to feel, is never shocked and surprised by what you do. That's what I mean. First of all, somebody who really, really understands you. Now, a second criteria would be somebody you've already solved problems with. And I think I better define that. When you've had a conflict, pretty serious one, and you have solved it so you're not continuing to have that conflict, and both people feel like it was a good solution, then I would call that a problem solved. I mean, sometimes I've heard people say, oh, we've solved our problems, and we've had some conflicts, and we've solved them, and usually what happens is one person just gave up. One person's a little more assertive, a little more insistent. One person is a little bit more of a peacemaker. Don't make waves. And a lot of people think that that's problem solving. What actually happens is that there's an erosion of trust that goes on. So if you had a conflict, and instead of it being an abiding conflict, it's over. You don't fight about that anymore, and both of you feel like the solution was good. So somebody who really understands you, somebody who you can solve problems with. Now, by the way, almost every rabbi I know, every priest, every Muslim, every imam, every pastor usually tells people, marry somebody of your same faith. And some people would say, why didn't you mention that? And the only reason I'm mentioning this is say, you're a pastor, and why didn't you say marry somebody of the same faith? Well, the point is, I think I actually already spoke to it, but I might as well pull it out just so people don't miss what I'm saying. If your faith is important to you, then a person would have to share your faith in order to understand you. So if your criteria is, I want somebody who gets me, who really understands what makes me tick, and your faith is important to you, then if that person says, well, I don't share your faith, it's fine, but I love you, that must mean your faith isn't important to you. It doesn't really help you make decisions day in and day out. It doesn't really affect the way in which you think and feel and deal with your own problems. Because if it did, and that person doesn't share the faith, that person doesn't really understand. Because if they understood, the value and the beauty of your faith, and the person would be on the inside. So I guess I could say shares your faith, or your lack of faith, by the way. really understands you very deeply and anticipates how you are, you're going to be, and never is surprised, and then lastly solves problems. There's 3. Okay. Somebody else. Gotta have a mic.
Hi. So I've been a Christian my whole life. In fact, I met my husband 7 years ago at Redeemer. 5 years into marriage, and I would say we have a great marriage, but he would say I have a lot of flaws that I'm not changing at a rapid pace or as fast as he would like me to.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love your thoughts, from a Christian, like how would I focus on changing those? I pray and I read my Bible and all these things, and I really focus on changing. But I think it's harder at the end of the day than I think.
You're going to almost. That's a great question. Almost, if you say I've tried, and my spouse feels that I'm not making very good progress, they should get a third party involved. You should get some kind of counselor who you both trust. That would just simply hold you. I mean, there's a couple issues. A counselor has a little bit of an objective view of things. I mean, if you both agree, by the way, if you both agree, these are some things that need to be changed, and I'm just not seeming to be able to do it. I don't know. I would have to say 2/3 of your problems are over. You need a coach. Now, if you disagree as to what the problems are, then there's more work to do. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. I
mean,
guess they're
it's a
not
little
major
embarrassing.
flaws, so I don't think a counselor is needed, but continually, I'm trying to work on them, but they're not going away.
Yeah. Well, then if you know they need to change, then you need, from a Christian point of view, we're just talking about involving you in more Christian community. When you got married, that's actually a very intense form of Christian fellowship. Because you're brought into a relationship that now has shown you things that otherwise you wouldn't have seen. Now you just have to supplement the fellowship, as it were, with somebody else who can just help coach both of you. I think so. Okay.
Thank you. I really like the analogy about the truck driving over the bridge with the cracks in it. And I feel like when you have kids, that's a second truck on that bridge. And I'd love your thoughts on the Christian perspective of, I have two children now, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and it feels like when kids enter the picture, the degree of difficulty of marriage kicks up several notches. And your thoughts on how that all plays out in the most successful marriages. Right.
I would actually, there's 2, if Kathy was here, because when we talk about this together, I usually say one thing, Kathy says the other, so I have to say them both, right? So you get the full. What I usually say happens is years can go by, and the husband and the wife, because you're with the children all the time, are in the same room and seem to be always together. But you actually find you're becoming more and more strangers because you're not actually able to talk very candidly. You're really not talking to each other. You're talking through the children. In fact, sometimes you can have arguments through the children, which don't do that. There's in fact, you can actually, what very often happens is you may curtail your own work. You start to have children, you say, I just can't travel as much, or I have to be home more often. And so you're doing a lot of things in order to be home more, and therefore you're in your spouse's, and maybe the spouse is doing the same thing. You're in the same room and in their presence, but you're actually not talking to each other, and usually at night you're too tired. And you essentially just don't talk to each other as directly as you used to. And some people would say, well, don't you have disagreements about the children? Yeah, but probably no more than you have about everything else. That's the problem, as simple as that. And you are simply going to have to find the time. I mean, for me, it was a double whammy, because on the one hand, I had to, as a minister, my job is just all-encompassing. I had to cut down hours in order to spend time with my family, then I began to realize that my family isn't collective only, it's also Kathy. How do I, so then I realized that I was spending all this time with my family, but I was spending very little time with Kathy in particular, and then I had to cut down again. It was hard. What Kathy's going to say, and I'm only saying this because she keeps saying it, I don't know it. She says one of the problems that women have, at least a lot of women she knows, is that a lot of mothers find that they get a lot of their skin hunger and need for physical affection satisfied by their children, and they actually don't have as much hunger for it from their husbands, because this is what she would say. She would say, the desire for physical intimacy with my husband is more complex than my husband's desire for physical intimacy with me. She would say, in my case, an awful lot of it is the cuddling and the emotion and the touch, and not necessarily the arousal and the sex. So she actually found her desire for physical intimacy with me going down because she had babies. And she actually would say it was one of those things that women need to be aware of, that she said that was a peculiar issue for women. So there's a lot to say, but I think that's all I'll say on this right now. There are a couple of hands up here. Okay.
Hi. I actually have two questions, like one on each end.
Okay.
So one thing is the criteria that you listed for like finding someone that you want to marry, like someone who understands you and someone that you can solve conflicts with. Like it seems like you could be dating a person for a really long time before you are sure about those two things. And so, is that does that sound right to you, or is this like something that should become apparent really quickly?
I don't know I'd grant that. I mean, this is your first question. I don't think I'd grant that. It depends on the kind of time you spend and how much time you spend. There's no doubt that if I take a girl to a movie, eat out afterwards, we got 3 hours together, 2 hours, an hour to eat, and 2 hours of the movie, and talk a little bit on the way home. Obviously, you're not moving toward the goal very quickly that way. So it depends, I think, on how much time you spend and how often. So I don't think I'd grant that. I think your knowledge of that could come together relatively quickly. It shouldn't have to be a long time. So.
Okay. I guess my other question is on the other end. If you are in a marriage where you've been neglecting each other, and like you said, like you're not acting like you love each other, and therefore you're not feeling it, and the cycle continues, and this has gone on for like 18 or 20 years, like what do you do then?
Well, that's too general. In other words, your case study is a little too general for me to respond to. I do want you to consider this. I almost said it a minute ago, but I didn't. I would certainly not be a person who says there's no grounds for divorce. As a Christian minister and as a Bible teacher, I know that the New Testament gives you two grounds for divorce. I mean, Jesus actually was asked at one point, is there grounds for divorce? He said yes. So there are such things as marriages that actually can end, need to end. People have trampled on each other. The trust is destroyed. It can't be rebuilt. There's ways of people being unfaithful to each other. So I wouldn't say that every marriage has got, any marriage can be healed and repaired. But I guess I think I'd answer the question a little bit like I answered a minute ago. I would say it needs intervention. And I would, just like a doctor, I would say I'd want at least a couple of different counselors to look in and a couple of different friends to look in. Because generally there's blind spots, almost always. When you sort of are stuck and you feel like, I'm not happy and she's not happy and we're sort of stuck, almost always we got to get either we start with our very closest friends and just open up and say, tell us where one or both of us are being blind, or you bring in counselors, you bring in somebody else. So it's just it shouldn't go on that long. Honestly, you shouldn't let it go on for all those years. You need to say, this isn't good, it's going on too long, we need to get that intervention. But I would never say that there's hope for any marriage. I wouldn't say that.
Thank you for speaking today. Really enjoying your discussion. I had one question about a sort of distinction you made between, say, like a mature love and when you described, for example, the first time you kissed your wife, and the mature love was, great is the praise of the praiseworthy, whereas maybe the first time you're physical with somebody, it's more of an ego boost, as you put it. Could you explain maybe that distinction a little bit more? Because they both seem to be a sort of similar idea. This person you think is great, likes you, whether she's kissing you or it's the 18-year marriage version.
No, wait a minute. I probably need to repeat this question to make sure I get it. You're saying, are you just asking me to explain more deeply how you know the difference between an ego rush and real love?
So pretty much the way you described real love was that you admire this person into the sky,
right?
He admires you back. Is that different in quality or just
okay?
Degree?
All right. Well, then let me try to answer that. First of all, I guess I want to say that I think the ego rush is inevitably there in anything that ends up becoming really great married love. So I don't think that can be. I don't think that can be removed. I mean, if you the ego is there. I guess I've been trying to say, if the main thing that attracts you are not character issues, but frankly, if it was just in the New York Times the other day, if things like women disproportionately look at height and economic capacity, and men disproportionately look at body and face and things like that. If there isn't something that's attracting you beyond those things, that's a bad sign. I'll put it that way. On the other hand, I just don't know that you could eliminate that. I mean, there's no. It's natural. It's fun. It's right to say, I can't believe she loves me. I mean, she likes. I can't believe she's really after me. That's fine. I'm just saying that eventually it fades because after a while the novelty wears off, and you hope that there was a core there that you had developed that will take you through, and that core, I think, is based on the other qualities besides what we just mentioned, which is the physical and the financial. That's my best answer. Okay, so you can't avoid it. You could just try to create a core that's going to, when the shell falls away, that'll still be there. Okay? You're nodding, so it looks like I got at it a little bit. Okay. Somebody else. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Hi. Can you talk about the role of dating from a purely biblical, scriptural perspective, and what the passages say about the role of dating before marriage and the difference between being engaged and just dating or getting to know someone?
So you're asking me, first of all, from a Christian point of view, what would I say about any guidelines for dating, right? Okay. You know what? There's nothing in the Bible about dating. So it's an area. That's the reason, by the way, why I have no problem writing a book on the Christian view of marriage. There's a whole lot in the Bible about marriage. Whenever I see somebody write a little book on the Christian view of dating, I always say, "Why is there? What is that?" Because there's nothing there. I would say once you get your vision of marriage, that's my whole idea behind my book. The book is as much for singles as for married people. That's one of the things I hope is unique about it. It's not so much there to say, here's how you fix your marriage, which is what a lot of marriage manuals are like. Nor is it a polemical book, about here's what's wrong with our culture and here's what we have to do. It's actually a book that gives you a vision of marriage. I was trying to let myself feel it as I was talking to you, even though there's a lecture here. I was trying to show you your imagination needs to get captured by the Christian vision for marriage, and then let your dating be affected by that. That's all I can tell you. Back out of that and say, all right, if that's the kind of marriage I want, eventually, what should that mean? Generally, what it means to me is, real general, is the older you get, the more you ought to make sure that your dating isn't just too casual, that you should probably only seeing people that you think there's any possibility of. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of hurt feelings. I mean, when you're 18, it's one thing. When you're 20, it's another thing. When you're 38, it's another thing. I mean, I still know guys that still who are in their 30s who want to take women out in their 30s, single women out, and they're surprised at how serious they get so quickly. And I just want to say, get a lobotomy. What is wrong with you? Why wouldn't they be thinking right away? The older you get, the more you should be serious like that. It shouldn't just be a frolic. But by and large, I'm afraid to go much further. than to say, I don't want to put down those guidelines. I don't want to be that kind of legalistic. There's a lot of talk about it today. When you asked me about engagement, I don't think I understood that. Were you saying what's the difference between?
Well, if two Christians, like for example, my boyfriend and I are both Christians, but we're not engaged. We just started in college.
Right.
So it's kind of like we're not dating, but for example, in church, it's either you're single or you're married. So how do you kind of find yourself in Scripture when you're not either?
I don't know. I mean, even engagement. I mean, I would just say we're serious, and don't let anybody put you into a category if you can avoid it. Just say we're dating exclusively. You can say that we're really, really serious. It's sort of like we're probably going to get married unless in the future, but we're talking about that. Don't worry about what the church says. It's a problem. I know churches are communities and they want to stick you in the mold, but the Bible talks about marriage. Then conduct your so-called dating life accordingly with what the Bible says, and don't have people tell you, well, you can do this, you can't do that, because the Bible doesn't speak about dating. In fact, that means the Bible fits into any culture. It fits into cultures in which communities get together and suggest that people date, or in other words, it fits into any culture at this point. That's what's neat about it. Okay.
Thank you so much for coming. What advice do you have for two people who are engaged, who are about to enter into a marriage?
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear your, talk about premarital counseling, which is great, but above and beyond, perhaps, from that.
So if you're getting married, you mean what I would do for premarital counseling? No.
No.
Okay, beyond that.
Advice for people about to get married, to set themselves up for successful marriage.
Okay, so the question is, what advice would I give to somebody who's about to get married? Not premarital counseling technically, just like a handful of, most wise guidelines.
Someone just said read the book. I agree.
Well, it's true. I was very close to saying that's what the book is basically about. That I think. Okay, I'll go through the chapters in my head. Wait, first of all, marriage is about long-term commitment. So that's chapter 1. So don't get too discouraged in the short run. Don't immediately say, "Oh, it's not a fairy tale. It's not supposed to be a fairy tale." Number 2, the basic cancer of your marriage is self-centeredness. You both come into marriage with it. You're both self-centered. That's the main thing that's going to kill your marriage, if anything kills it. So look at your self-centeredness as your enemy. Instead of thinking that I have been brought into a conflict with my husband, or my wife, it's actually marriage has brought you into a conflict with your own self-centeredness. If you can conceive of that, that is a huge breakthrough. Thirdly, mission of marriage, which I already mentioned, which is basically become best friends and figure out how that happens. Fourthly, I guess I would say, well, here's one more thing. Make sure that, here's the last thing I'll say, because nobody asked me about this. It's astounding. It's astounding. But you should look at sex as a covenant renewal ceremony or covenant cement. Sex is God's way of saying to another human being, I belong completely and exclusively to you, and you must not use sex to say anything else to anybody. That means is, every time you have sex, in a sense, you're remarrying. You're confirming the covenant. You're reenacting it. But one thing that Kathy and I learned a long time ago was we are so... sex outside of marriage is so different than sex inside marriage. It doesn't in any way prepare you for sex inside marriage. Because sex outside of marriage is basically a way of enticing and impressing people and a way of getting fulfillment. Sex inside marriage is basically about giving yourself, and just serving the other person and just pouring yourself into them. It's utterly different. And one of the things we realized was that if you get used to performance and fulfillment in marital experiences, sexual experiences outside of marriage, when you get into marriage, you are not prepared for the main thing you got to do, which is just have sex, whether you feel like it or not, to say I love you to the other person. And some years ago, I had 3 married couples in my church at the same time, within 6 months, come to me and said, our sex life is terrible. And I said to them, I want you to have sex every other night, or at least whenever you can, and I don't want you to even think about whether you're getting aroused or having a climax. I want you to do nothing but care about whether the other person is. Don't even worry about it. Just say, my goal is to bring that other person pleasure. And then I would meet with them. And 1 week later, I said, how's it going? And they'd say, weird. And then I would see, 2 weeks later, I would say, how's it going? They would say, better. 6 weeks later, they said, this is incredible. When I stopped trying to perform and stopped feeling like I was getting anything, or even stopped even, asking whether I feel like having sex or not, and just used it as an extension of everything else I do in marriage, just another way of saying I love you, just another way of giving myself to you. It just became part of the warp and woof of marriage instead of always being an issue that we were arguing about. So there we go. Okay, that's all. There's a couple extra things that I didn't mention that are in the book, and I think that's it. Looks like 1 o'clock to me. Stephanie, you were it's 1. You want to do one more?